Through pictures and reporting from American journalists, the 1968 battle for the city of Hue during the Vietnam War reminded older and affected younger Americans at that time that urban warfare is not pretty.
This is what the war in Vietnam is all about.
The courageous 26-day battle fought by American servicemen for the control of Hue City, the culture center of Vietnam, was the largest urban city battle fought by U.S. forces since the battle for the capital of South Korea, Seoul, 28 years earlier during the Korean War in 1950. The battle for Hue City started during the period leading up to the start of the traditional Tet holiday in January of 1968. The Tet holiday celebrates the beginning of the Lunar New Year and incorporates festivities like those celebrated by Americans during Christmas and New Year. During the Vietnam War, it was customary for both sides to enter an informal ceasefire truce for the 7-day holiday. It was not uncommon, given the culture and imperial importance of Hue City, to have combatants visiting their families, many from both sides whom called Hue City home. What was different in 1968 was that U.S. intelligence suspected, but did not have substantial evidence, that the North Vietnamese were not going to abide by the truce. As we will hear tonight, the North Vietnamese had been planning for months to launch a multi-theater surprise invasion of the South. During the days leading up to the start of the Tet holiday, the North Vietnamese amassed a force of 74,000 troops. Hardened North Vietnamese Army regulars and Viet Cong guerrillas already operating in South Vietnam joined forces with troops that snuck in across the South Vietnamese borders from bases in Cambodia, Laos, and the DMZ from North Vietnam. As part of the North strategy, Hue City was one of the 36 South Vietnamese provincial capitals, 64 district capitals, and 50 hamlets to be attacked during as part of the coordinated surprise invasion. In 1968, Hue City was in the northern section of South Vietnam, 31 miles south of the demilitarization zone, the combat zone that divided North and South Vietnam during the Vietnam War. Hue was South Vietnam's third largest city. Since 200 BC, Hue had been the geographical center of the area that makes up both North and South Vietnam. With its easy access to the sea, control of the area had been fought over for centuries by invading countries, regional tribal warlords. During this same period, Hue City had become Vietnam's leading culture and religious center. The Vietnamese are an exceptional homogeneous population. Their culture has been shaped by decades of Chinese oppression, French colonization, and briefly, Japanese occupation. Although there is a strong Buddhist and Confucian heritage among the Vietnamese, French colonization has also implanted a thriving Catholic tradition. Hue, as the imperial city, was the traditional host of the prominent Tet holiday festivities. By late January of 1968, several thousand visitors had arrived in Hue in anticipation of the holiday festivities to join Hue's existing permanent population of 140,000 citizens. In 1968, most of Hue's populace remained aloof from the war. With their imperial heritage, the city's religious and intellectual leaders advocated strong local autonomy with an emphasis on traditional national values. They largely distrusted both Ho Chi Minh's communist government in Hanoi and the U.S.-supported government in Saigon. The city itself is divided into two distinct towns separated by the Perfume River. On the northern bank of the Perfume River lies what is known as the Citadel region. Roughly 5 square miles, this fortified section of the city was built in the 1800s under the direction of Emperor Nung Yan. An built his fortified palace within the region using what is known as the Citadel line of defense. The term citadel means fortress, so called because of its smaller defensive core. Key to the defense are multiple structures projecting outward from the main walls surrounding the inner and outer city. The walls were 30 feet high and in some cases 40 feet wide. Angular in shape, the structures are positioned at the corners of each wall to allow protective fire on the walls, flanks, and adjoining bastions. The strongest part of the system are the high towers, strategically placed within the walls. The towers were built in position to be the last line of defense should the enemy breach any of the components within the fortification system. A second city, referred to as the New City, was built on the southern side of the Perfume River to the south of the citadel by the French during their period of colonization. This region was about half the size of the citadel. America's involvement in Vietnam started after the communist North Vietnamese defeated the French colonists in 1954. North Vietnam's goal was to reunite both North and South Vietnam as one country under their control. America's strategy, started after the end of World War II, was to contain the spread of communism.
To support free peoples who are resisting attempted subjugation by armed minorities or by outside pressures.
America's early intervention was limited to providing advisory support to the South Vietnamese government in their battle with the Communist North. However, by 1965, America began a more direct intervention with a steady buildup of American forces supported by America's technological superior armaments, including the ability to conduct strategic bombing campaigns of North Vietnam. As American military presence began to grow in Vietnam, so did the media's.
It is the 10th day of the fighting for Saigon, and although the official military...
In 1964, the Vietnam Press Corps had only 40 members. By 1965, that number had grown to 419. By 1968, there were over 600 accredited journalists from all nationalities reporting for wire services, radio, television networks, major newspaper chains, and news magazines. During World War I, II, and Korea, the military enforced a strict policy on how and what information was provided for public distribution. In Vietnam, that changed. The Military Assistance Command made military transportation readily available to journalists that wanted to access the areas of combat. With this access, a credibility gap began to build as the in-country journalists and reporters questioned the facts as were being reported back home by the administration and its commanding generals. The credibility gap encouraged journalists to root out stories for themselves, making journalists much more independent.
Richard Threlkeld, CBS News, near the Cambodian border.
The result, the media began to publish uncensored pictures and videos. By 1965, Ho Chi Minh, North Vietnam's communist leader, realized that the United States' superior, well-trained, technologically military power limited his ability to fight a conventional war. He adapted his strategy to tactics associated with those of guerrilla warfare. Even then, with America's apparent endless source of resources, Minh knew he was losing the war of attrition. 1968 was an election year for America's president, Lyndon Johnson. The media was reporting evidence that America's public was starting to openly question how the war was being handled by the Johnson administration. If Minh could not defeat the Americans in the field, there was the chance he could indirectly defeat them by eroding the Americans' public's confidence at home in the war effort. Minh had to create a situation. The plan, a large-scale action, coordinated attacks at bases throughout the South. If reported, such an attack would destroy the rosy picture of success being presented by the Johnson administration. He also believed the large offensive could spark an uprising among the South Vietnamese populace against their unpopular provincial government. Minh developed a three-phase battle strategy. The first phase began in the fall of 1967 with a series of probing attacks that tested and measured the American defenses in critical locations. The second phase, a simultaneous, coordinated surprise attack during the Tet holiday truce on the weak points identified during Phase 1. Hue City was one of the 36 Vietnam provincial capitals, 64 district capitals, and 50 hamlets to be attacked during the first 48 hours of the invasion. Hue was critical since it was a key checkpoint along the U.S. and South Vietnamese line of communications and supply routes from the DMZ to the north, all the way to the south to Saigon, and the western boundary of Laos. third phase, never implemented, would have consisted of a second wave of regulars from the north to reinforce victories achieved during the Tet Offensive. Hue was home to two small military units. The Citadel housed the headquarters of the 1st Infantry Division of the South Vietnamese Army, the ARVN, under the command of Brigadier General Nung Tung. Across the river in the new city was home to approximately 200 American I-Corps Military Assistant Command Advisors, MACV. American combat assets in the area included the 3rd Marine Division, which had been deployed to the area around Khe Sanh, northwest of Hue, in defense of a perceived invasion by the North Vietnamese Army. In a diversionary move, men had attacked the area 2 weeks prior to the launch of the Tet Offensive. To the south, Marine Corps battalions of the 1st Marine Division were protecting the air base at Phu Bai and western entrance to Hue. Elements of the U.S. Army's 1st Cavalry and 101st Airborne Division were also operating in the area. Evidence of an impending invasion was building. On December 20th, 1967, the United States Commanding General for Vietnam, William Westmoreland, cabled Washington that he expected the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese to undertake an intensified countrywide effort, perhaps a maximum effort, over a relatively short period of time. Given the activity around Khe Sanh and the military buildup along the borders, U.S. intelligence suspected the Vietnamese were not going to abide by the Tet Truce. On January 31st, 1968, military intelligence suspicions were proven true. From bases in Cambodia, Laos, and across the DMZ from the north, men invaded the south with a force of approximately 85,000 troops. The force was made up of hardened Vietnam regulars and Viet Cong guerrillas. Squadrons of locals had been recruited to advance the planned populist uprising by the South Vietnamese citizens. The concept of fighting in cities did not receive much attention by the United States military until the middle of World War II. Basic military strategy at that time focused on having adequate number of personnel to meet the needs of the battlefield. Marching through France, following the invasion of Normandy during World War II, the tactic commonly used by the American forces was a rapid movement of manpower supported by massive firepower to shock and kill the defender. During the Korean War, most fighting did not happen in cities except for the capital of Seoul. In Seoul, Marines would identify strongholds and, with the use of guided tanks and supporting infantry, break through the enemy's strong points once again with firepower. In the fighting leading up to Hue, American warriors had plenty of experience in fighting in the field, rice paddy, hills, mountains, and the natural jungle. The battle for Hue City was the bloodiest and longest battle of the Tet Offensive. 4 U.S. Army battalions, which fought to the north and west, 11 Army Republic of Vietnamese battalions, ARVN, and 3 understrength U.S. Marine Corps battalions fought in the new city and the Citadel, defeating 10 battalions of Viet Cong and North Vietnamese Army regulars. The losses during the Battle of Hue were great. In 26 days of intense house-to-house fighting, mostly fought without intelligence, air, or heavy artillery support, 147 Marines were killed, with 850 wounded. Approximately 8,000 civilians lost their lives, including somewhere between 3,000 to 6,000 executed by the North Vietnamese and Viet Cong during the siege. In return, it is estimated American and Allied forces killed over 8,000 communists. The proximity to the battlefield carried over the obvious risks for journalists. Although no journalists were killed during Hue, more than 60 journalists lost their lives during the Vietnam War. The Tet Offensive marked a major turning point in how the media covers war.
It made quite an impression on me. The communists swept right into it and took it.
During Tet, the media focused on the few unfavorable combat actions that prolonged the ultimate defeat of the North Vietnamese intrusion. An event that was not lost on the warriors in Vietnam when they received news from home shortly after the North Vietnamese had been routed. While it was clear that the media had more access to both the war's positive and negative events, The negative events were more akin to the emerging style of the new television medium. There were also the uncensored pictures of both the military and civilian casualties. Media coverage of the war became predominantly negative. The percentage of victory stories reported began to decrease. There was a willingness of high-profile journalists and broadcasters to make critical statements about the information and strategies put forth by the various administrations.
Bring an honorable end to the war in Vietnam.
In the end, as the war got uglier, public support for Americans' involvement in Vietnam declined significantly. So tonight, as we honor and tell the story of our Hue Marines and gallant photographer, we do so with everlasting gratitude for their service, sacrifice, and courage, and for the lessons learned that are benefiting today's warriors who tonight go in harm's way so that we can enjoy the peace, tranquility, and freedom of this beautiful night in the land of the free and the home of the brave. And with that, I present you the men and pictures of the Battle for Hue City.